Hey there, what's happening, Golden Bears? I hope you're keeping it classy. I am Mr. Vomsteeg, or also known as Steger, and welcome to my course. As part of this flipped classroom model, I'll be doing my lectures via this format, and then while we're in class is where we're going to be working on skills and a little bit more of the content as well, hopefully making it a little bit more interactive as we do this. So join me this year as we delve into APUSH, as it's begrudgingly called by most across this nation, almost 520,000 of them that will end up taking the exam. So hope you are ready for this show, and let us dive in. Today we're going to be unpacking our time period 1, or module 1, our textbook calls it, where the Europeans make claims in the Americas. So before we dive into that and jump into module 1.1, I'd like to start with this kind of current event in terms of the Olympics of 2020. Here was this amazingly talented woman here by the name of Raven Saunders, who had a very challenging upbringing in America, and she began training for the Olympics and doing the shot put. If you were able to watch any of the Olympics or subsequent years, you would see that she has her hair in this green and purple fashion, and she would walk around with her mask on during this COVID time that was like the mouth of Hulk. And she seemed like a menacing person walking around and with these cool glasses on. But she was the talk of the Olympics during that year as a 25-year-old shot putter. Well, she went on to perform as the Hulk would and earned a silver medal. And while on the stand, she celebrated that. But as she stood off, she lifted her hands up in this X format as a matter of a way of acknowledging some things. The media asked her, what was this X about? And she said, well, simply, it is the intersection of where all people who are oppressed meet. So it was there then that she expressed the challenges of the disenfranchised or the dislocated, or those who are the marginalized peoples, those who are part of the LGBT community, anybody who has been some degree of, treated poorly or bullied, etc. She says she did this in honor of them. I think this is a significant thing because in history, we are also here at this convergence. And in this time period of pre-1491, before the arrival of the Europeans, we see the Americas, or the New World, completely in hopefully a new light. And today we're going to unpack a little bit of that to where you can begin saying that they are distinct and vibrant communities. And in fact, hopefully you're going to see some aspects of the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Incas, and even those in America as we know it, from the East Coast, the Iroquois tribe or the Iroquois Confederacy, all the way over to the West Coast, if they were the Chumash Indians there of Santa Barbara. So with that, that's my opening, a little introduction as to what we'll be covering in this time period 1. So the arrival of the Europeans to kind of where they engaged in this new landscape called the New World. So with that, Module 1.1 is talking about diverse American Indian societies. And with that, I want to share a little story. Here is Diego Rivera's artwork. He's an artist from the mid-50s that was hired by the Mexican government to paint these big murals in their Palacio Nacional, that's their national palace. And here you can see the city of Tenochtitlan. And in the foreground, you see the native people groups there who were probably the Nahuatl Indians, who had ample capacity to be considered sophisticated. Just by way of comparison, London at this time had about 20,000 people in it. Look at this city. Some argue the Aztec Empire was between 2 to 6 million people alone. And then if you include the different nations that were under their, brutal regime, there were close to 6 million people that answered to them in terms of tribute, etc. So can you imagine this city back in its heyday? Well, I went there with our family many years ago. Just many years ago, and my boys were still young, And we left the heart of Mexico City, went about 25-mile bus ride out to this Valley of the Moons, it was called, where you had two opposing pyramids, one of the sun and one of the moon, and you can visually, get a scope of how magnificent this was. Well, there were vendors. It was a hot day, warm. We ate some food, and they offered us this drink called pulque. And I said, "What's in this pulque?" They go, "Well, it's made of the melinge type of fruit, which is basically a derivative of a cactus." And I'm like, "Oh, cool!" So they had tons of flavors, everything from watermelon to pineapple, etc. And I go, "Ooh, I'll try the pineapple strawberry one." So I'm sipping on that, and my wife got one, and she's like, "Ooh, this doesn't taste very good. It's kind of vinegary and but that acidic, kind of like a kombucha, I guess is what the best thing you would call it." So I'm saying, "Oh, refreshing and fun," and drinking this, and my wife's all, "Nah," and I let my boys try it, and they're like, "Ooh, no, this isn't that good at all." And if you've never had kombucha, you can kind of, sense that it grows on you if you come to like it. For the rest, you're like, "No thanks, pass." So I just finished drinking that, and I finished drinking some of my wife's, and we're walking through the thing, and then we're starting to hike up these steps. I'm like, "Wow, what's going on? I'm feeling a little lightheaded here." Come to find out, when I get to the top and I'm kind of talking with some people up there, I'm like, "Dude, have you tried this pulque?" They go, "Yeah." "Did you know that's the fermented drinks of the Aztec people?" I'm like, "Oh, fermented beverage of the Aztec people." So bad on me. There I was, having a little feeling of fun and gregarious up on the top of the pyramids of the moon, having a little local beverage of the gods called pulque. If you're to go there today, they still serve pulque, but be sure that you're of age and that you know what you might be getting into with that story. So with that, we are going to be encountering Christopher Columbus, probably in subsequent videos, but today we're not going to camp out there a long time because we're going to be focusing on the indigenous people groups of this area of Mesoamerica. But listen, look at this quote here. It says, "I've come to believe that this mighty continent which was unknown, your highness, have an other world here." When he went back to report to his king there in 1498, that this was the true find that they had been hoping for, and wealth, untold wealth and riches for the taking. Now, whether you agree with Columbus or not agree with Columbus, we will certainly do some debating on whether he was good or bad for the Americas, but just recognize that he was the early founder of this region. In this course, you're also going to kind of be using these graphic organizers as you go through and read. They are meant to help you look at the information and how to take the reading and put it into categories that will be easier to review as you pack on. I'll talk more about that in class. And I blast through this relatively quickly because in class I'll go back and review some of these items. So in this module, you're going to recognize and hopefully learn that it is diverse societies in the Americas, not some simple group of people that were just burning fires and throwing sticks and stones at each other that most people in Europe thought. They discovered that these people in the New World were incredibly diverse, were incredibly rich in political, social, economic structures that rivaled many of what they had found in Europe during that time. We also see that there are factors of competition for resources that shaped the relationships between the Europeans and the non-Europeans during this time. So with that, let us jump in and kind of recognize that the world, all right, some allege 25 million years old, some allege 16 million years old, but we were just a speck floating around in space, and that speck turned out to be one of the fifth smallest planets in our planetary system. And during that time, wherever you believe on when man began to emerge, but between 6,000, I guess man was found 13 million years ago. I'm sorry, 13,000 years ago, with evidence of the bone tracings. But in the Mesoamerica region, in the Middle Eastern region, close to 6,000 was the time period. But as we begin to recognize, there was tons of movement of people groups as the Earth continued to expand and constrict. we need to recognize that these people groups came to the Americas using different land routes that are explicable to some and inexplicable to others. I'm not going to get into those debates at this point as to how they emerged and how they came, but just recognize that when these different people groups did move southward, they formed communities with unique languages, close to 2,000 of them, with unique cultures, unique religious systems, unique agricultural or hunting practices. And so we just please note that around 10,000 years ago, okay, as these migrants came from Asia into this new world, as we call it today, they brought with them the capacity of developing new agricultural and horticultural aspects. We will talk about the three sisters later on in another lecture, but we need to be mindful that corn was the centerpiece of these main civilizations, and because of corn, they were able to become sedentary. Corn and beans and squash are the perfect combination of caloric and vitamin intake. And because of these three sisters, they're called, it enabled them to remain in one place, these various complex societies, the Aztecs, the Mayan, and the Incas. And because of that, they were able to develop into a more diverse and stratified society. So please know the term the maize, the agricultural revolution. You need to recognize that because maize spread out of Mexico City and up to Pueblo, which is in modern day New Mexico and the Rio Valley region of New Mexico, this maize enabled certain civilizations to grow. And so we'll talk more about Pueblo a little bit later on and the development of irrigation there in this warm area of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Pueblo, that really was unique to that region. Well, as you can see, that maize here on this map started in Mexico City and moved its way into the Pueblo region, up to the Great Basin of Utah and New Mexico, and even made its way into the greater Mississippi Chahoika people that I will try and talk about here in a little bit later on. So as I go through this lecture and as you go through reading, here is a great graphic organizer that will be asked to be done as part of the class. And so I would encourage you to go check your Canvas and be able to download this sheet of paper to follow along as you're reading. And even as I'm lecturing, you can begin to filling in a couple of these notes. So the first point that we want to talk about is that of the Aztecs, the Maya, and the Inca people. The Aztecs being around Mexico City, the Maya being around modern day the Yucatan Peninsula. I'm trying to think of that town that a lot of people like to go vacation in. I'm drawing a blank, but it's in the northern Yucatan, Playa Carmen, etc. And then you have the Incas, of course, down in Peru. All three of them had had similar attributes made possible, partly because of fertile soils and partly because of the development of corn or maize in their regions. So what we find here is that they have large urban centers, and you've seen pictures of them, namely like this one here in Tenochtitlan with the river, the lake systems being used to transport goods back and forth into the centers. You have highly ritualized religions. The Aztecs, if you don't know, would kill up to 5,000 of their captives a year in order to appease their gods of their time. And they had complex political systems. In fact, only certain people went into the Holy of Holies, if you wanted to call it there. The temples here in Tenochtitlan, it was the same amongst the Maya people, and the Yucatan was the same amongst those in the Machu Picchu area of the Incan Empire. And so when you can imagine when Columbus arrives, he's expecting to find sticks and stones taking place, and instead he sees millions of people in one city, and he's like, oh my crikey, what are we going to do? So with that, briefly, I'm going to just, touch upon the people of the Tenochtitlan, that what made them unique is that they were semi-nomadic, but they were able to begin using their maize, their beans, and their squash to develop systems that made it very fertile for them to become more sedentary. It's called Three Sisters farming. What are the Three Sisters? Well, maize would grow on this land that I'll talk about here called the Chinampas. Basically, if we look at this section here, the Chinampas are these little stretches of land right here, and where they'll have a little house there, and they would farm on those sections there with the corn. And why are they called the Three Sisters? Well, as the maize grows upward, okay, you then have the beans that would then kind of like Jack of the Beanstalk would go around them that way, getting ample sunshine. And then third, the squash then would grow on the ground and keep the sun from beating down on it and killing the roots of the stalks of the beans or the corn. A brilliant system. And because the weather there in Mexico City would bring ample water, as you saw around the lake and everything there, and appropriate weather. It's not above 80 in the summers and very tranquil, like I guess in the winter months. They had 3 growing seasons on these artificial islands or these chinampas that were there. This is what catapulted Mexico or the Aztec people into becoming one of the most complex societies in that time period, where you see everything from pottery and gold being developed, to weapons and sharp tools. Now, what is very interesting, however, is how do they build all these? So here's an Aztec housing. Sorry, I forgot that I'd put that in there, that you can see. And they'd use these boats to travel from place to place, and they used everything from the fishing there to growing of that. Now, notice little turkey right there, huajuelote in Spanish. Huajuelote, that there is indigenous to the Mesoamerican people. And so here you can see them farming on their little chinampas plots there and creating about an amazing complexity in there. Back to my point, uniquely, the Aztec and people and the Mayan people and the Incan people did not have a wheel invented at the time. They were incredible mathematicians. And in fact, the Maya people they had pyramids that were designed that, depending on when the solstice hit, the summer and the winter solstice, actually is kind of cool. On the side of the pyramid, on the shadow on the ground, you would see a serpent move as the sun came across on the summer and the winter equinox. Incredible how they had capacity in understanding the stars and everything about that. Well, there outside of the Yucatan Peninsula, man, I wish my brain could remember the towns that you'd be familiar with it, but it's a famous vacation spot, and we haven't been to it, but I know tons of people have, and maybe you have yourself. But it was here that this people group developed this idea of irrigation and water storage. Why is this important? Well, Mexico City was built upon a lake, and they brought in dirt to develop those chinampas there. Here, it was mostly forest there that they had to tear out, but the water sources had to be dug to them. And so it was really incredible ways in which they adapted to the environment. That's a key thing that you're going to want to keep in mind. How do these early civilizations adapt to the environment about them? Okay, and what technologies do they bring about to them? And so here you can see this solstice of this that you would kind of notice if you stood on the far side of this section here on the ground. You would see coming off of this thing would be this cool serpent type of thing emerging. Rather cool and pretty impressive of that. The Incas, I know you've heard about them, but some claim, okay, between the Aztec, the Maya, and the Incas, and if you're able to include those in North America, namely the tribes that we're familiar with, there were close to 52 million people. Now, that's debatable. That comes from a professor in the mid-1990s who made that statement. How do you prove or disprove that thing? It was rather challenging to do, but if we go with that, it's a very, very conceivable that these civilizations were sprawling. Take a look at this one. 16 million people over 350,000 square miles. Immense capacity for the Incas in order to keep that many people groups in communication. Talk about a political system that was needed there to keep them tied and unified. Impressive, to say the least. So here's a picture of Machu Picchu, kind of like the before with the roof lines on top of that, and to where they are in present day. So these big questions are things that we will talk about in class. So if you want to get a head start, you certainly might want to look for these answers in your actual reading as we go. This class discussion we will do in class as well. And here's another handout that you can begin using in your reading and preparing you as well for this next section I'm going to be lecturing on and talking about Native American tribes or people groups here in North America. So here we can see that America has its share of Native American populations emerging here as well. So here we have the Yucatan Peninsula with the Mayans. Here we have Mexico City and the Tenochtitlan, and down here we have the Incas. Well, here we're going to begin seeing the Pueblo people, or here we're going to see the Iroquois nation. Notice how they develop along either different waterways or access to the coast, okay? And so, you know, location is going to become the big influential factor as we begin studying these here in the North American Indian population. And so I'll be asking some questions about those when we get into our lecture time. So we're first going to focus on the cultures in the Southwest. So again, if you have this document here printed out or in front of you, this will help you to kind of fill in some of the answers as we go, okay? And so what makes these regions of New Mexico and Arizona so unique of the Hohokam people or the Pueblo people is that they have adapted. You gotta either adapt or die, okay? And in this situation, they've adapted. How do they adapt? Well, they brought the corn up from Mexico City in order to maintain staying in one location. They develop irrigation systems, and so that's going to be a common trait amongst those in the Southwest and how they were able to do it. Notice they brought also the three sisters up here, the maize, bean, and squash as well, taken straight out of their dear friends down the Aztecs. And I say that not dear friends, that was sarcastic, but certainly that. And this is, the Pueblo people are also famous for having their homes were either adobe brick, their closest access point to where the farms were, or they were dug into the cliffs, where one section of cliffs in New Mexico had over 6,000 interconnected rooms. It's an impressive thing to go see if you have a chance one day to go do that. Well, in class, as part of our understanding the skills, we're going to be unpacking primary sources, so I'll talk more about that in class. So here's some pictures of the Cliff Palace there that we will be examining in further detail, but where there are over 6,000 rooms that are interconnected in this region here, where they had storehouses of food and water, etc. Really impressive site that details the complexity of the Pueblo people. Okay, now let's look at the Great Plains. You can recognize that these are groups coming from Colorado all the way into Canada, and these are hunting societies that would follow the major migratory animals. So here we have the bison. Notice I didn't say buffalo. Buffalo's the wrong way to refer to them. They're bison, so don't be ignorant, okay? Bison. And what did they create? Well, they developed a couple of things that enabled them to bring down these large game. The atlatl, which was a spear-throwing device that was so unique to them. Go look that up and what it might look like. But they also developed ways in which to shoot smaller prey between the bow and arrow, or also how to do fishing. Okay, the Mandan people were unique, as we're going to see here. You're going to learn about them a little later on when we're going to talk about famous Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. They actually stayed with these people groups, the Mandan, in the North Dakota regions as we know it today. And look at this level of sophistication. I mean, Lewis and Clark were a ragged bunch of misfits traveling, you know, as along the Platte River Valley in this situation, and they come across a group of Native Americans who are, one, sedentary, but two, have a system of political, economic, religious, social, intellectual things taking place there. They were like floored by the Mandan that were there. So hopefully you can see what I'm trying to convey to you, the importance that these weren't sedentary, ignorant, people groups that were like, oh, woe is me, we're fearful. Almost every one of these people groups had unique aspects to them that essentially reflected their environment around them and how they had to survive. What about those in California, out west, the Chumash Indian or the Chumash, depending on how you want to enunciate them? They're in Santa Barbara, and these were primarily hunters and gatherers, and it was like they were living on heaven on earth. In fact, that's what the Chumash people referred to the area of Ventura, Santa Barbara, as it was heaven on earth. Why? The weather's perfect. They had the ocean to catch. They had rivers nearby. The weather was always perfect. There was ample water supplies. And it was that they can travel in these large canoes, the tomals, to actually go out to the islands to go catch beaver pelts that were really in plentiful of millions of numbers until the Russians had come later on to kind of overfish and overtake. We then have kind of, I call it mixed. So we have in the Northwest, but we also have in the Great Basin these different people groups there that you might be mindful of. So those in the Northwest are what we would think of the Alaska people groups and the Alaska tribes up there who developed various forms of unique things. They developed these Chinook houses, so please be familiar with what made them unique, and totem poles to depict their religious practices. And then you had in the Ute people groups in present-day Utah. That's why if you go to Utah State, they're called the Utes, and have some American Indian logos on their helmets and stuff. What made them rather unique is that because they were practically nomadic in them, they had kinship bands, which was unique, is that they would intermarry. And what did this create? Well, if you intermarried with a sister from one tribe and another brother from this tribe, etc., they don't fight and kill each other. So this created an extensive trade network of peace, rather unique in terms of that. Are we sophisticated yet to understand? Yes, this is incredible, because even the Europeans of this day couldn't get along. That's hence why they're out looking for new lands to conquer during this time. So here we see a picture of the Ute people in Colorado and how they lived in their nomadic lifestyle and were able to survive the elements and the environment from which they were in. And the Iroquois Nation, or the Iroquois Confederacy. We're going to talk more about them later on, but you need to recognize that up by the Great Lakes region, that they were an incredibly sophisticated group of people that had a couple of aspects that were unique. One, they were a confederation of different tribes that worked together, much like what we learned with the Ute people here that had extensive trade networks. They took it to the next level, okay? This was like they were the Amazon of everything. They knew how to communicate, to talk, how to exchange, and it was an amazing thing to experience. And so you can imagine when the Europeans arrived and they're like talking to the Iroquois, like, can you get this for us? Yeah, I got that. Can you get this for us? Yeah, we got that. And, so it's a really amazing, sophisticated group of people the Iroquois Confederacy was. Now, what made them increasingly significant, and this is what you're going to want to be mindful of, is they were matrilineal, meaning all of the goods that they owned were only passed down through the eldest female. This is one of the few people groups across the globe that was part of their hereditary practices. Part of the Samoan culture did that, and there was a Filipino culture, and one of them in Africa, I forget the name of it, that believed in this matrilineal type of inheritance. Rather unique, that I hope that you'll be mindful of as you continue to write these things down. So here you see the Iroquois longhouses there, and the sophistication of it to weather the rain and the snow there, and they lived in these big, large communal houses there. Now let's talk about the Southeast, and we call it the Mississippi, but really you got to go up from St. Louis and up into the Ohio areas here. But here the Cahokia people were unique, that they built these earthworks and temple mounds, not like the Aztecs, but they didn't have the rocks, etc., to bring them in. Okay, and so they built these mounds, and in fact, one of these mounds, they say, covered over 16 square miles, if I'm doing that correctly, which seems rather huge, an area for these mounds to be building up between one another. But when they said close to 20 to 25,000 people lived in that area, that kind of goes to show that, yeah, it could have been possible. Again, corn is their centerpiece there, and they had a trade network because of the river system that went all the way from the Gulf of Mexico, namely New Orleans, all the way up into the Great Lakes, what we would know as Montreal. today's time. Now, why did this great society of the Cahokia people decline? They can only speculate that it might have been a drought, changes in climatic conditions, etc. So here you can see a picture of them at all. So again, we will discuss the importance of these things in class, but there we are, almost coming to a close to that thing. So by way of summary, conclusion is that we need to be mindful that geography and environmental factors shape the development of all these civilizations found in the North America and the Mesoamerica regions. And what made that unique is that this developed incredible diversity. I mean, in one part of the Pueblo people of near New Mexico, they had to learn to irrigate their corn. In Mexico City, they had the Chinampas, where they grew 3 seasons with the 3 sisters. They developed new practices with that. And you need to remember the importance of maize and how maize went to numerous parts and helped groups become very sedentary, large, and complex. In other words, you cannot say that prior to 1492 that people living in Mesoamerica were so desperate to have the intellectual people groups of the Europeans to show up. And what you're probably going to find out is that things begin to fall apart the moment Columbus and his posse set foot on the Mesoamerican soil. So with that, keep it classy, Golden Bears. We'll be seeing you in class, and have a good rest of the day.